Yujin, I want to believe in God, and so I look at God's characteristics to ask, is there anything to which this collection of traits can really refer? And I know God's all-powerful, knowing, and all good, and all of those things. But the most fundamental thing, at least as I see it, in terms of God's real existence, would be as if God is self-existing. Because if you can get past self-existence, that is the one thing that is impossible to deal with anything else other than God. So how should I begin to think about this concept of self-existence?
The concept of self-existence is very interesting, because if you can prove that God is self-existent, or God exists necessarily, then you can prove that God exists. Because if God exists in all possible worlds, in all possible situations, then God exists here as well. So that's why this is a very unique attribute that God is meant to have. Now, we are all contingent beings, so we just exist by accident. And arguably but everything in this universe is contingent. And now, if we want to explain the origin of contingent beings, we have to appeal to something necessary. So here, we might say that God is the cause of everything, and only God can be the cause of everything, because God is meant to be a necessary being or self-existent being. God is the only being that doesn't rely on anything else.
Now, that answers the question, but it answers it seemingly by cutting off the question, because the natural atheistic challenge to all arguments about God, for God, is who created God? And so by telling me God is self-existent, you're just telling me to shut up. Don't answer. I'm not going to answer your question, who created God. I'm saying God is self-existent. So that ends the conversation.
That's the end of the conversation, because if God is self-existent, then it's not legitimate to ask who created God. That's not a good question, because by definition, God is self-existent. Self-existent being doesn't have any external cause.
But you're the one who's making the definition. You're giving me the definition of God as self-existing, and then you want me to accept it and not ask anything further. Now, I'd only be willing to do that if you can defend it. How can you defend that anything, call it God, is self-existing?
Right. So suppose that I say that this chair is self-existent. It's cause of everything.
I won't believe you.
That's right. You shouldn't believe that, because that's a silly claim. But if I say that God is self-existent, it's not that crazy, because God is meant to be the greatest possible being, and greatest possible being is meant to be self-existent.
Well, but isn't that circular? Aren't you creating an entity to fit a magical definition?
It's not like I'm assuming the existence of a self-existent chair. It's not that I'm saying that let's assume that there is a self-existent God. I'm not doing that. What I'm saying is that God is by definition the greatest possible being. And arguably everyone can accept that. And from that, we derive the claim that God is self-existent.
So I can follow that. That's step one. You define God as that which nothing else can be greater, classical definition, and then say, what is one of the characteristics that than which nothing is greater? And that's self-existing. That's fine, but that doesn't in any way ascribe reality to it. It just is just a kind of a two-step process that creates a definition of something that seems fairly mystical or to some nonsensical.
It would be extraordinary if we can run this kind of conceptual argument to prove the existence of chairs or tables. But maybe God is an exception. God is meant to be the greatest possible being, which is very, very different from other beings. So maybe this is an exception where we can construct a pure a priori argument to prove its existence.
And can you say anything more? Can you talk about the constituency, or what would, even in principle, what it would take to be self-existent? It's so beyond our capacity to understand.
Self-existence is fairly simple. It just means that the being in question exists in all possible worlds or all possible situations, in all possible states of affairs. unlike us. Our existence depends on other things, our parents and so on. But the self-existent being doesn't require any external cause because it exists necessarily. It doesn't require any cause or any pre-existent being.
Are you satisfied with that?
Yes.